John. I appreciate you setting things up. And again, I want to just express appreciation for my esteemed panel here. Dr. Ramesh Matan, CEO of Bell & Howell, Chairman Taub, we've talked about, and the Honorable Professor and Emeritus IG, David Williams. What I just want to do is spend about 5 or 6 minutes and explain a little bit more about what this excursion was, what came out of it, and what our ultimate goal is. But the bulk of the session today is really going to be hopefully Q&A between the panel and you all. So as I'm talking and telling you a little bit about what we started to discuss in January, I encourage you to think of questions, throw them out here, because really the whole goal of this excursion, as John had said, this is where I have to get my clicker like everyone else, right? Not the green button? There we go. The goal of the entire excursion was to get the dialogue started. Again, working at GAO, we respond to congressional requests for information, and we had been asked to take a look at, well, what are sorts of things that would happen if you narrowed or eliminated either of the monopolies? And as you know, there are two monopolies: letter monopoly, mailbox monopoly. And in the course of doing that work, we've talked to a lot of different stakeholders. And that report isn't scheduled to come out for a couple months. But the big thing that you see is a lot of stakeholders have very strong views about what will or will not happen. But the goal is we need to get people in a room and start talking about what is the worst case scenario of what might happen. What do we want to do about that? Who should take care of that? And again, you look at everything in terms of opportunities and challenges. So that was sort of the purpose of this one-day event. So today I'll quickly go through kind of what we talked about. There is going to be a white paper that's coming out of that event. Those of us who have to write it know we have to write it, and it will be coming out. So we will be communicating those events as well as what happened today. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I think we all know a little bit about the monopolies, but obviously the mailbox monopoly as well as the letter monopoly were put in place for a variety of reasons, right? To protect the USO, to protect revenue, a little bit of safety and security in the mailbox. But as John talked about, and as we've talked about the last day or so, so many things are different now that it merits a discussion of, is this the right way to go for the future? And again, coming from the GAO perspective, where the Postal Service is my area of research, I can sit here and say, in addition to everything we've talked about today or yesterday, a couple things we know about the Postal Service. One is the business model that says everything they do should be paid for by the ratepayer. We know that's of critical concern right now because of the $60 billion in net losses over the past 10 years, the $120 billion in unfunded liabilities, the infrastructure. That's huge, but is it the right infrastructure for what we need now and in the future? And service, which we know the Postal Service had some service challenges. They're working really hard to bring that service back up, but there's still some struggles with that. So this is why we felt we needed this excursion. So on that one day, we talked essentially about a couple things. We talked about what is the purpose of the monopoly and how is it working? We talked about what do key stakeholders want from this type of thing. And when we say stakeholders, we very generally put them into 3 categories: senders, recipients, and service providers. And I know that's a gross generalization, but for purposes of categorization, that's what we did. And then we talked about benefits and disadvantages of changing or actually even staying, because I think what's pretty critical is that even if we do nothing, some bad things might happen in the future. So it's not sufficient just to sit and do nothing. So it was a small group. We purposely made it small. It was about 70 folks, but we had a great representation from government, regulators, vendors, consultants, the whole deal. So I got too many things I got to hold on to here. So one of the highlights of the day is what we called the Great Debate, moderated by the chairman, where we had people kind of talk about, well, what would be the benefits of doing different approaches? So we talked a little bit about retaining the monopoly. What would you get from that? Well, what the folks of the day said, well, it's what we know, right? We've built up this structure. The other thing that was raised is, what is the problem that we're trying to address? People talked about it's affordable compared to some of our counterparts in other countries. It maximizes efficiencies. Postal Service has economies of scope and scale, which we've talked about. Again, somebody talked earlier about the social, the nostalgia of the post office, the access, the right to get, universal service. But then we had people talking about, well, what if you modified it? what would that do for you? And obviously, one of the benefits there is it would allow other people into it. It might encourage innovation and some efficiencies, but potentially the best thing about modifying, again, the mailbox monopoly is you would allow people to kind of do what they do best. And you could potentially get the best of all worlds. And again, right now we have this co-opetition, but maybe there'd be even more collaboration in a new environment. And then we have, the radical, like, well, let's get rid of it. Let's eliminate this mailbox monopoly. What would that do? And, the thought there was you really are talking some innovation. You're talking maybe more looking at the system globally to say what's the larger picture. And again, when you think about what's happening in the future and what our customers are going to want in the future and what they need, what is the best approach? And the question was, maybe it's time to do a real analysis of what the best approach is for the future. So after that rousing debate, we kind of opened it up a little bit more and we asked people to talk about what are the pros and the cons and the challenges, and I'll get to that slide in a minute, because that's what I want to be a springboard for the conversation for these folks. But at the end of the day, we administered a little survey to the participants in the room, and we asked them a couple questions. The first thing we said is, which of these three options, retaining, modifying, or eliminating, which of these would negatively affect senders, recipients, and service providers? And interestingly, what that survey said was there was an equal number of people who said retaining the current monopoly and eliminating it would both negatively affect these groups when you think about what's happening in the future. We also asked people to say, what do you think is the best approach for the postal ecosystem in the future? And overwhelmingly, the respondents said modifying the monopoly. Now, for all of you folks in the audience, not a representative sample, maybe not statistically significant to the world, but it's an indicator that there's some thought that, maybe we recognize we need to change a little bit. And of course, the devil's in the details, of course. And that's what we'll talk about in a minute. The other question we said is, if there are already negative impacts of making no change or of making a change, should we try to do something to address those negative impacts? And overwhelmingly, the survey respondents said yes. And of course, they said, well, who should be the one to do that? And they said Congress should be the one to do that. So then that gets us to the next piece. If we think that there is action to be taken, and if Congress is the one that should take the lead on these actions, what are the key things that Congress has to think about? What are the key considerations to make sure that if we make a change, or even if we don't make a change, but given what we think might happen with the current monopoly in the absence of change, here are the four things that are critical that we need to think about. Service. Again, service, quality, and access. And essentially what you're talking there is the USO. Again, we've been operating under this system for hundreds of years now where people feel like they should get access. It's never been defined, and I'm going to ask my panelists later to talk about sort of the service issue. But you don't want to do anything that potentially could adversely affect that. But the real question is, what is the service that we need in the future? How do you want to pay for it? And what our customer is going to say is the necessary option for them. The second issue is security. It's kind of ironic, I think. We just did a job where we were looking at sort of the impact of broadband access on use of mail and access to post offices. And it's kind of ironic that we have a system where there's no locks on a lot of these mailboxes. And yet sometimes people are more concerned about sending information electronically than they are with putting a check in their mailbox. And yet theoretically anybody could go into that now, but the theft is not a huge problem. Well, I have IG folks here. It's not that it's a huge problem, but considering that the mailboxes are open, there's not as much theft as you might think. So what would you do if you started to have additional people in those mailboxes? How would you guarantee the privacy and the security that people are used to or they have a trust with the current situation? And solvency, USPS solvency. You have to talk about that. They're the big player. I mean, this is a huge ecosystem, but Postal Service is a huge player in this. If there are negative impacts on the Postal Service in terms of volume leaving the system, in terms of additional competition,
How would you make them whole? And importantly, if they keep their unique legal status, how would you make them whole without unfairly making them whole and hurting the ability of others to come into the market? And then the final thing is technology. You know, we've heard a lot about technology over the last day, and there's a lot of opportunities for technology to address some of the challenges we just talked about. But technology is not always the panacea, because sometimes there are unintended negative consequences when technology comes around. So how do we ensure that we can get the best out of any technological solutions, and yet try to avoid some of the pitfalls that technology might bring with it?